Welcome to the theory for Psych 350. We're talking about the Neo Freudian theorists. We started, the first theory started with was Freud, obviously, and we'll branch from there. To start, we won't branch very far. We'll talk about the kind of the immediate reactions and revisions to Freud's original theories. And remember, even his theory, if you can talk about one distinct theory, was a work in progress until the day he died. So some revision that took place regarding Freud's theory, Freud did himself. But we'll talk about other people's revisions, changes in emphasis, and things that they maybe added. So the Neo-Freudians in general held true to many of the key concepts of the original theory. That's why they're called Neo-Freudians and not just some other name. For example, things they kept generally were the influence of unconscious motivations on behavior, the use of defense mechanisms to address anxiety, but then there are certain areas that different theorists either disagreed with or felt needed more elaboration than Freud gave. Let's take a look at three of these. One, the way that personality comes to be. Right? For Freud, generally personality, how you were as a person, was pretty well set by childhood, and some of the Neo-Freudians disagreed, most especially ERIKSON, which we'll see when we talk about his work in a minute. Another point of departure would be the degree to which social factors influence the development and expression of personality. Freud was very much about kind of these biologically based instincts, and generally neglected the influence of social factors, including kind of cultural, political factors, and to some degree, some would argue he didn't pay enough attention to parenting behaviors and how those influenced a child's development. And then the third thing would be the view of humanity. Freud was a bit of a downer, had a very pessimistic view of humanity. Human nature at its base wants sex and aggression. Although Freud himself didn't think that this was a bad thing, just that's how people are, and it's not bad to want sex and aggression. But society says we need to restrain these impulses. But these Neo-Freudians and later theorists provided a more kind of optimistic view of humanity in terms of that we're striving for more than just to get our needs met, our pleasures, and to exert power over others. That maybe there are some more altruistic motivations and loftier goals to human behavior. Okay, so the first person we'll talk about would be Alfred Adler, and developed a field of study that was later termed individual psychology. And Adler's stuff is generally about superiority. Right? This idea that we're all born with a sense of inferiority, which makes sense because babies are inferior. I mean, they can't throw a baseball, they can't type an email. I mean, there's lots of things babies can't do. They just pretty much sit there and cry and poop and eat. I mean, they can't feed themselves. Yeah, so, but the idea that you're born in this world and it's all kind of big and noisy and complicated, and they're doing things that you can't do, and for a good part of your life, other people can do much more than you can. So according to Adler, given this kind of biological reality, we all develop a sense of inferiority, that we're not as good as those around us. Assuming we don't compare ourselves to other babies, obviously. And then we spend the rest of our lives striving to overcome this sense of inferiority and establish a sense of superiority. And I'm sure you've heard the term inferiority complex. It's kind of one of those things that's entered into our everyday language. And for Adler, only some people will develop an inferiority complex. The idea being that everybody feels a little bit inferior. But if you feel too inferior, so if your feelings of inferiority are too strong, then you might have this kind of complex. And when if you feel, well, there's no way I can be as good as other people, then you won't strive for superiority, which he saw as this kind of healthy thing. But instead, you will shrink from the challenges in order to avoid confirming your deeply held belief that you're just not as good as other people. In addition to kind of the striving superiority, the other piece that Adler added to make us sound not so much like schmucks was social interest. And this is the idea that for proper kind of healthy adjustment, you need more than just demonstrating your superiority via your achievements. Okay, I'm trying to show my superiority, and doing so I'm being healthy, For Adler said that's good, but if you just do that, that's problematic. You also need to achieve things. You have to demonstrate your superiority in such a way that you're also benefiting others and not oppressing or harming them. So the tobacco executive who rises to power and wealth in the company, she might not be considered well-adjusted despite the fact that she drives a Bentley. Right? Whereas the executive who works maybe in some say pharmacological field and developed drugs that saved millions of lives, and the company donates free drugs to third world countries, maybe that person has both the achieving of superiority and the kind of accomplishments, but also benefiting others, and so has that social interest component as well. And the people that have that, they're going to be more well-adjusted. If you're missing one, then you're going to have these adjustment problems. In terms of development of personality, Adler very much emphasized parental influence. And this isn't so much a departure from Freud, but more emphasis, more leverage. Because Freud did talk some about parents and his psychosexual model in terms of when you're meeting a child's needs for gratification, are you frustrating them or are you allowing for over gratification? But Adler said it was more than just that, more than just those psychosexual stages. We talked generally about the amount of attention and care you're giving to a child. We talk about kind of two extremes being potentially negative. One extreme, pampering, right? So, and this is not just about doing nice things for your kids. You can say that's bad, but if you are kind of overprotective, the helicopter parent, it's always hovering, and you don't let your kids deal with difficult or dangerous aspects of life, then they will develop this kind of dependency and become kind of dependent, helpless adults, because they won't ever have to strive for superiority. At least they won't know how to, because you've never let them face any challenges. So that's one extreme of kind of negative parenting for Adler. The other extreme would be neglect. So if you don't protect them at all from dangerous, difficult situations, then they will kind of develop this cold and suspicious personality to where they don't think anybody will ever be there for them, and they totally have to look out for themselves, which at that extreme will probably lead to failure in future romantic relationships. So, and then beyond the kind of emphasis on parental influence, another one of Adler's big contributions was his emphasis on the role of birth order. And talking about firstborn, middleborn, and lastborn. The idea being that kids that are firstborn initially receive a lot of pampering, but then they get dethroned when the next child comes along, which leads to feelings of inferiority to the level probably of an inferiority complex. So these are going to be kind of your problem kids who are less well adjusted than the other kids. Whereas a middleborn child is always kind of a step behind their older, stronger siblings. So they get a strong sense of striving for superiority, but they're not neglected too much, not pampered too much. So kind of like your Goldilocks, where the middle thing is the just right. And then the lastborn being the baby of the family, and therefore pampered by everyone and overly protected by parents and siblings, leading to them becoming dependent and fairly helpless as adults. And this kind of brings us some interesting dynamics. Some support in the literature for some of the things about the role of birth order, but not clear cut. Oh yeah, Adler was definitely right. So birth order does seem to play a role. It's correlated with certain personality traits, but not exactly in the way that Adler proposed. Okay, we move on from Adler to Jung, Carl Jung, the mystic of the group, right? And he came up with this idea of the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is this construct, this idea that there are thoughts and images that each of us are born with in our minds that prepare us to react in a particular way to things we will encounter later in life. That is that everyone's born with the same thoughts and images, hence the collective unconscious. So you still have your personal unconscious, your own stuff, your own crap that's buried below, but you also have some stuff buried below that you're born with, that everybody is born with. For example, everybody being born with kind of a mother image, because everyone will be, at least theoretically, experience some mother figure, someone that nurtures and cares for them. Right? Because as humans, we're not independent at birth. Can't fend for ourselves. Some being will have to provide nurturing. And for Jung, we're born with this kind of image that tells us, okay, you need to cry to get this person's attention, and when they give you it, stop crying and look at their face and smile at them. So we have these kind of prepared images and patterns that prepare us to respond to a mother's nurturing and seek her out, usually it's her, for care. So these images and thoughts that fill the unconscious, Jung referred to as archetypes. And there are as many archetypes as you can think of common situations in life. So anything where you can imagine, okay, well, in all cultures and at all points in time, people will experience, a mother, and people will experience good-natured people and evil-natured people. People will experience someone wiser than them that teaches them things. Anything that you can think of that's a common human experience, Jung had an archetype for. Let's look at a couple of these. One would be the self, which is obviously yourself. But for Jung, the self was this kind of transcendental concept that's a combination of opposites, the yin and the yang, the individual and the collective, the anima and the animus. So your masculine side and your feminine side together, everything that's opposite that exists at polar ends is together as the self, but it's also more than the self. So it is this very kind of transcendental concept. I mentioned the anima and animus, which are archetypes of the feminine and masculine sides of ourselves. And Jung hypothesized that in seeking a romantic partner, we seek one who matches our anima or animus, depending on this. And for Jung, he was assuming heterosexual relationships. So a woman who has anima and animus, the animus being the masculine side, seeks a man who matches her animus. Right? So her masculine self, the part of her that's masculine, she looks for a man that matches that and feels that to make her complete. And same for men. And in finding a partner, you each achieve completion. Another archetype you hear talked about a lot would be the shadow, which is the evil or dark part of ourselves and the world. So we think about the dark side, which that sounds like Star Wars. Yeah, which shouldn't be that surprising. Star Wars is heavily influenced by Jungian archetypes. George Lucas had read work done by Joseph Campbell, who studied Jung's work and developed his own kind of mythology based in part of Jung's work. So there's lots of stuff out there if you ever want to Google Star Wars and Jung. You can read all about the archetypes portrayed in those movies and books. Anyway, so there are these ideas that we're born with that prepare us to deal with common experiences in life. That's what archetypes are. It's sometimes a difficult concept to wrap your head around, but if you can get that main point, you'll be in good shape. So, what do you think? Because Jung's theory is probably the most mystical and least concrete of the ones we'll talk about. And for you, does it seem true that certain archetypes appear across cultures and across time? For example, one of the archetypes and kind of myths that Jung talks about would be the hero myth. So every culture has stories in their folklore, in their art, about someone, some hero rising up to meet a challenge. And frequently there are these kind of common elements where the hero has some special weapon given to him or her in order to achieve their quest. I think of the kind of the King Arthur Excalibur, or Luke in the lightsaber, Tolkien's Hobbit and the Ring. Right? So we have this hero character striving against evil forces with some special thing, and usually there's this wise older man, the wise character in there. So if we see that across cultures, across time, can you think, is there any way to explain that, to explain these commonalities across cultures, especially with cultures that at certain points in time had very limited contact, without using the concept of a collective unconscious? Why else would there be these similarities if that weren't true? And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you, but something I want you to think about. And then, if you can't come with an answer, then think, okay, well, does Jung's explanation make sense lacking any other explanation of these commonalities? Okay, let's talk about Erikson. Developed ego psychology, which was elaborated by other theorists later on. But one of his main contributions was expanding the role of the ego beyond Freud. Right? For Freud, the ego is just this mediator dealing with impulses from the id, strictures from the superego, and limitations presented by reality. But for Erikson, the ego works toward establishing identity, which identity in general is a big concept for Erikson. But the ego is trying to, who you are, and it works in this process of figuring out who you are, and also towards mastery over the environment. And if we think about, okay, he talked about mastery over the environment, what theorist does that sound like? Striving for superiority. Right? So Adler. So a lot of these Neo-Freudians are oftentimes saying similar things using slightly different language. So expand the role of the ego, but one of the things that Erikson's probably most known for now would be in regard to personality development. Oh, sorry, there we go. And with regard to personality development, he looked at across the lifespan much more than Freud. Remember, Freud kind of stopped, in childhood and said, "Oh, you're done." Erikson's developmental theory looks all the way from birth into older adulthood. One thing, though, in your book, it kind of uses this metaphor for Erikson's developmental theory about a path with forks in the road. So these different stages, you can go one way or the other. And that's an okay metaphor for general understanding, but it may be a bit misleading in terms of how Erikson really talked about his theory. Because for Erikson, each fork isn't really a fork, it isn't all or none. So when we talk about the first stage, trust versus mistrust, it's not that you're either going to develop a sense of trust or a sense of mistrust, but it's a degree to which you establish a sense of trust or the degree to which you establish a sense of mistrust. And it's not a clear all or none situation, it's a matter of degree. Okay, so we'll talk about these different stages, these forks in the road, if you like that metaphor. And one thing to remember as we're talking about this, again, is it's not all or none. And the other thing, the degree to which you achieve one way or the other at each stage will influence what happens at subsequent stages. Okay? So the stages are connected in a way. So the first stage, infancy, trust versus mistrust. So you're born dependent on the result on adults for care and nurturing, which again sounds like what we talked about with Adler. And then the degree to which your needs are met, including the need for affection, but also feeding, getting your diaper changed, all that stuff. An infant will develop a basic sense of whether the world is safe or dangerous. Right? Which this concept is a key component to a later theory of attachment as espoused by Bowlby. So kind of just file that in the back of your mind. So in some ways it's related to Freud's oral stage. Because for Freud, the infant is dependent on adults to provide pleasurable oral experiences. For Erikson, it was more than that. It was, do you get your needs met or not? And then those experiences with usually a caregiver, maybe caregivers, but usually a primary caregiver, have a profound impact on how you see the world. Is it a safe place where you get your needs met, or is this kind of dangerous place where I'm hungry and I'm wet and I'm tired and I can't do anything about it, and nobody out there is going to help me. I can't trust anybody. I better figure out how to do this stuff myself. Okay. So a very important stage, as you can imagine, influencing the rest of the lifespan. we move on toward around age 2. We have autonomy versus shame and doubt. So around age 2, children are able to kind of exert some control over their world. Right? They're toddling around. They can do some things for themselves. And the degree to which they're allowed to explore and exert control will influence their sense of self-efficacy. Right? So if you let them run around and get into stuff, they establish and said, okay, I can do things for myself, and I have some autonomy to where I can do stuff. But if they're told, no, stop, dangerous, oh, you're going to hurt yourself, stop, then that will establish a sense of shame, like, oh, I'm bad for trying to do things, and doubt, I don't know if I can really do things myself without somebody else looking out for me. Which again should sound familiar, kind of like Adler's idea about the impact of pampering. If you don't let kids experience some level of danger, distress, they'll become dependent. So the terrible twos for Erikson is just striving for autonomy, and it's developmentally appropriate and should be to some degree allowed and encouraged. And the next stage really builds on the previous one, initiative versus guilt. Once you're able to explore, and then you find yourself more in the world, and more problems are presented to you, and opportunities to create new experiences for yourself. For example, organizing a game of Duck, Duck, Goose. So here, the degree to which children are again allowed to or encouraged to solve problems and initiate activities will further influence their sense of self-efficacy and also their motivation for taking action. So they'll either develop a sense that, oh, I can do stuff, and I found that I can make new fun things, and so I want to, and this is fun and good. Or every time I try to do something, I'm shut down, told you can't do that, you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to hurt somebody else, and I feel guilty for trying new things, and so I'll become apathetic and not willing to take risks and do things for myself. So I'll wait until I'm told what I can do. In the next stage, it's kind of school age. We have an industry versus inferiority. School comes along and you're presented with new challenges, and you find yourself also being compared to others. And it's, you have these same age peers, which may be different than in the home, where they're getting stuff right, and either you getting stuff right too, or you're getting it wrong. And so, if you're successful, and especially in comparison with your peers, then you'll feel confident about your abilities. And if not, you may feel inferior, which is, again, we can feel kind of Adler's influence here. So, after talking about these first 4 stages, note that the second through the 4th stages are all in some way related to this developing a sense of self-efficacy. So you come into the world, and first it's, okay, is it a safe place or not? And then it's a matter of the next couple of stages, early part of childhood up until almost adolescence, is figuring out, can I do stuff for myself? Can I solve problems? Can I come up with new things to do myself? So once you figure out that, okay, I can kind of do things on my own, then the next logical question is, well, who exactly am I? This person that is able to do stuff, well, what do I want to do? Where do I want to direct my abilities now that I feel confident that I can do things? So we get into identity versus role confusion, right, in adolescence. The big questions of who am I? What are my values? What's my place in the world? So there are a couple of options here for Erikson. Obviously, clearly more than just the 2 forks. One, after some period of exploration, you can kind of figure out who you are and develop a sense of identity. I would say that's the best thing. 2, you might stay stuck in this exploration. I don't know who I am, I'm still looking. So it's kind of ongoing search for identity. And then a third outcome would be that some people might prematurely end the exploration of identity due to whatever pressures there may be, and they'll adopt some convenient identity, either that of their parents or of their friends. So trying to figure out who I am is kind of stressful. Geez, I don't know, well, my mom and dad are, they like to bowl, and they go to this church, and they vote this way, and they drive this kind of car. I'm that way too. Because it's easier to do that than to really try to figure it out. Right? And so just because somebody adopts an identity similar to their parents or friends doesn't mean they wimped out. That's one possibility. You could explore things and figure out, I really am this way, and it happens to be similar to them. Some people, Erikson would say, take the easy road out and adopt an identity that's not true to themselves because it was anxiety-provoking and stressful, the process of seeking identity. But again, for Erikson, I know this may seem like, okay, well, you can do it here, and then whatever happens here, you're stuck with. Not so much. If you don't achieve a sense of identity during adolescence, it'll lead to problems in the later stages, but you might eventually establish a sense of your true identity. It's not a now or never scenario for these things, but much easier now, at the appropriate stage than later. Into early adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. So this is whenever you're seeking an emotional connection with another person. And this is one of those ones where it's really clear how success in the previous stage will likely impact what happens in this stage. Because how can you be intimately known by another, which is what emotionally connected relationships are about. How can you be intimately known by another person if you don't intimately know yourself? Right? How can someone else love me if I don't love and know myself? Is the question I think Eric would pose to people. So make sure you work through that identity before trying to seek out a relationship. Otherwise, you'll likely end up adopting the identity of the person you're with in order to achieve that sense of intimacy and avoid isolation. So it's important for some things to kind of go in order here. And on to middle adulthood, we have generativity versus stagnation. And now the focus is shifted from the self to, at least in the last stage, it was shifted from the self to one other. So, all the first stages were, am I safe? Can I do stuff? Who am I? And then we get into, okay, how can I be with this other person? So it begins this other focus. And now with generativity versus stagnation, the other focus is more pronounced, to where the question is, what am I doing or can I do for others in the world, for future generations? What contribution am I making? And it could be in terms of raising your own kids, helping other children, achievements at work, building a hospital, writing a book, penning a poem or a song that people will change how people feel. Doing those things that will have a kind of lasting impression beyond your own life. Being able to do that is considered success at this stage versus feeling stagnant and stuck and kind of developing a sense of emptiness and a lack of purpose for your life. And then the last stage for Erikson would be ego integrity versus despair. And this is where you're looking back, reviewing your life, and either you feel good about what you've done in your ego integrity, or you despair that there's not time left to do what should have been done. Okay, then the last Neo Freudian theorist to talk would be Karen Horney, and known for two major contributions. One would be her work, clarifying what neurosis is and what a neurotic individual is. And for her, neurotic individuals are anxious people, kind of sad and anxious, who want to be loved, they want to connect socially, but they can't because they feel anxious and inferior, and they develop these patterns, self-defeating patterns of interpersonal behavior that sabotage their interactions with other people, and thereby perpetuate their feelings of anxiety and inferiority. So wanting to interact and feel good and feel superior, achieve maybe, but not able to do that, and developing a pattern of behavior because of the anxiety that keeps you from ever getting what you want. And for Horney, she, like ADLER, influenced the role of parents and enumerated multiple ways that parents could screw their kids up. Giving your kid too much attention, too little attention, being unjust with kids, where mom and dad can eat ice cream in the living room, but you can't. Instances like that, Horney argued, lead to anxiety in a child, and kids develop these behavior patterns to deal with anxiety-filled situations that they're put in. And the idea is that that's kind of typical, but if there's too much anxiety, there's too much crappy parenting, screwing the kid up, that kids will develop these patterns of such strength that they may be maintained into their adult lives. And at that time, they'll probably be problematic. I talked about 3 different styles of behavior, 3 different ways of being neurotic. One, moving toward people. So this is those individuals that they deal with the anxiety by reaching out for love and affection and being dependent on others. Moving against people, obviously, would be the opposite. So dealing with those feelings of inadequacy via aggression. So strike out and try to exert your power over others, which in the short term, again, will make you feel better, but will eventually alienate people and not lead to what you're really looking for. And then moving away from people, this kind of withdrawal and avoiding love and affection, and also possibly a sense of general emotional numbing. Okay, I feel bad. This isn't working out. I'm not going to feel. That's fine. It doesn't matter to me that these people are acting this way and they don't love me the way I want to be loved. I'm fine. It's fine. I don't care. So all 3 of these 3 different styles of neuroses. And then Horney's other major contribution would be her writings about feminine psychology, which is a broad term that we use whenever talking about largely a reaction to Freud's fairly sexist theory, the sexist aspects of his theory that seem to be influenced by social cultural factors which he didn't pay attention to. So one of the things she talked about, Freud talked about penis envy. So Horney, as a counter, offered this idea of womb envy and the potential that men are jealous of women's ability to bear children, and that the reason that men seek out business achievements and strive to make things happen in the workplace is to make up for a sense of inadequacy that they have from not being able to bring life into the world. And for Horney, it wasn't, you see, women are superior and men are down here. It was this idea that both men and women will see kind of desirable aspects in their gender counters. And beyond that, Horney generally kind of sowed the seeds of the later feminist movement, and not necessarily knowingly. There's just kind of how she felt. And she pointed out that that some of Freud's logic was a bit blind, like this idea of penis envy. She said, well, maybe it's true that these girls do want to be like the father and are envious of the father, but she argued that it's not because of anything inferior about women, and it's certainly not about anatomy, but it's because of the social disparities that existed at the time. Because having a penis, being a man, meant you got to do a lot more cool stuff. You could go to school where you wanted. You could choose what profession you wanted to go into. You had more freedom in choosing who you wanted to marry. So yeah, it makes sense. Why wouldn't you want to be like Dad? Dad gets a lot of the cool stuff. And for her, she argued that if those social disparities didn't exist, there would be no penis envy, which is hard to test, but also hard to argue with. Makes good sense. Okay, start thinking about applications of the Neo Freudian theorists. One of the things that they wrote and talked a lot about was religion. Freud wrote 2 books that address the topic, and for Freud, he felt that religion was a crutch to deal with anxiety, and that humankind created God. Something I want you to think about. If there was no God, would people create one? That's Freud's argument. And if your answer to this question is yes, if there were no God, people would still create a God image and develop a sense of worship and religion, So if that's true, does this mean there is no God? Think about if that logic makes sense to you or not. And then Jung talks about religion at one point about as being the myth of religion, or religious myth. And this is misunderstood a lot of times in terms of, oh, so religion is false. And the way Jung talked about myths, myth doesn't necessarily mean something untrue. It's like, oh, the Hercules myth, oh, that didn't ever really happen. For Jung, I feel that right in that field, a myth is a story used to make sense of things. So, you may hear people talk about the Christ myth. And that doesn't mean that they say that there was no person named Jesus Christ, or disavowing anything about that. It just means that there's a story which occurs beyond just that story about Jesus of Nazareth, but there's a story you find in a variety of cultures about a character who makes a great sacrifice for the good of others, and that's the Christ myth. So, a myth is just a way of trying to understand and communicate part of the human experience. So when Jung talked about the religious myth, it wasn't saying it wasn't true. He said that religion is a way of trying to make sense of the world. And then Erich Fromm was a bit more down on religion and found that wrote that religion was kind of the easy out for people not willing to take responsibility for finding meaning in their own lives. He said, that's one of your biggest things people struggle to do is to create meaning out of their lives, and why am I here? What's the purpose of being? And people who aren't willing to figure that out for themselves rely on religion. And my question to you is, does that make sense? If someone practices a religion, does that guarantee that they will have a deep sense of meaning and purpose? And if not, then Fromm's logic is flawed. So think about whether or not that makes sense to you. Another contribution of the psychodynamic theorists is the use of personal narratives in assessment. Personal narratives, whenever you have people tell a story about how they came to be who they are. And sometimes you ask about a lot of stuff. Sometimes you always ask, tell me about your earliest memory from childhood. Sometimes you ask, okay, tell me about the events that have most shaped who you are. Tell me about the turning points in your life. A lot of different ways of asking about it, but generally you're just asking for information about how did you come to be who you are. And they generate a narrative, and then you mine that data, those data, by searching for themes. So usually people will say this stuff aloud, and you'll record it, transcribe it, and then you'll give it the manuscript to a group of judges who will then search for some themes that you've set out before hearing what the person said. You kind of have an idea of, okay, most people are going to have some, they're going to talk about maybe affiliation, maybe they'll talk for striving for power, maybe they'll talk about overcoming struggles, but you have certain themes you're going to be looking for before you hear their story. And then you'll have these judges say, okay, how many of these themes do you see in this person's story? And then if the judges agreed on stuff, you have high inter-rater reliability, and you've got some confidence, okay, yeah, this theme exists in this person's story. If you don't have good inter-rater reliability, well, then you've got to do something else for your assessment. But that's the gist of how it works in terms of, well, is that accurate? People are telling the story of their lives. Aren't memories biased? Yes. But in many ways, that doesn't matter for the assessment, depending on what your goal is. Frequently, when you're asking the question about tell me about your life, it's not to figure out what happened to them, because people are notoriously bad reporters of past events, but it's how do you see how you came to be who you are, and that is important information in terms of their current self-concept. Asking about how they came to be who they are will give you an idea of how they see themselves, and also how they may make sense of any future events. The last thing about personal narratives, this method is often used to examine whether or not someone is achieving generativity versus stagnation. The thing about ERIKSON's developmental model. And so stories where turmoil leads to triumph seem to be more common in people who achieve generativity. So what does this mean? Does this mean that overcoming hard times leads to establishing a sense of generativity? Or might it mean that if you achieve generativity, by whatever means, that it allows you to see how tough times in the past resulted in growth? Right? So which way does the directionality arrow point? And my question to you is, how could you figure out which explanation was more correct? How could you conduct a study where you could figure out, okay, does generativity lead to looking at your past this way, or does looking at life this way lead to establishing a sense of generativity? How would you figure that out? Okay. So we've talked about the Neo Freudians, a couple of them, not all of them, but the main ones. We've talked about two ways to apply their work. Now let's talk just a minute about what we think. What did they do? Well, they did one of their major contributions would be the elaboration and expansion of Freud's theory. Right, they built on what Freud started, gave more prominence to the ego, talked more about development of personality beyond childhood, and then talked more about motivations beyond just libido and thanatos, right? Adding that other component of striving for superiority. Using different words to talk about that, but that's the other kind of main idea that came out of the Neo Freudians in terms of why we do what we do. In terms of degree of empirical validation, so how much are the Neo Freudians' work supported by theory? Well, like Freud's theory, later psychodynamic theories often don't lend themselves very well to empirical study. It's hard to measure the collective unconscious, so limited empirical support. But part of that is the nature of the concepts involved in the theory. Not so much that they're wrong, but they're difficult to study. Certainly more difficult to study than some of the other theories we'll talk about in the future. A criticism of Neo Freudians that individually they tend to oversimplify things. That kind of no single Neo Freudian theorist addressed all the concepts that Freud introduced. Instead, they focused on particular bits that they found interesting, and they left some things undeveloped. Which, if you look at any one of their theories by itself, it seems to be an oversimplification of Freud's theory. But if you look at all of them together, you get kind of this richer tapestry of ideas. But again, none of them obviously were able to kind of rival Freud as individuals. The closest maybe would have been Jung in terms of scope of theory and influence, but his stuff was a little bit too loosey-goosey, mystical to be understood and disseminated as widely as Freud's work. Nonetheless, despite these oversimplifications individually, collectively, these theorists acted as a bridge, right, from Freud to post-Freudian theories. Freud was very controversial, and the Neo-Freudians made some of his ideas more acceptable, enough so that theory and science were able to kind of move forward from Freud to Neo-Freudian to post-Freudian without having to start over completely. It wasn't like, because if we didn't have the Neo-Freudians, people would have gone, wow, Freud was, what was he smoking? Which, probably cocaine, what he was smoking. But they didn't have to just kind of throw away all of his stuff. The Neo-Freudians allowed other theorists to say, okay, well, this piece of idea that started with Freud and is elaborated by them, I can get that, but I see it more this way. And they were kind of move forward in different directions, which may not have been possible, may have slowed down the progression of theory if it hadn't been for the Neo-Freudian theorists. Okay, so that's it about the Neo-Freudians. Take care.